Deciding to lead a business and indeed scale a business brings its own challenges. It's why less than 1% of small and medium-sized enterprises ever achieve scale. I first came across the great work of our next speaker when I read her wonderful book, Stress Proof. I then had the great privilege of hosting her on ScaleX Insider. I found her incredibly humble, hugely experienced, and refreshingly practical in the strategies and tactics she shares, despite being a Cambridge-trained physician, neuroscience researcher, and renowned expert in her field. I am absolutely delighted that we are joined today by Dr. Mithu Storoni to share with us a hyper-efficient way to work, how we should manage cognitive fatigue, reduce stress, and balance mental and physical energy to optimize our scaling performance. I don't think you need to read this book, Jack. You're probably okay. Folks, please welcome to the stage the wonderfully endearing Dr. Mithu Storoni.
I just wanted to check the slide movers. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. Thank you so much for having me, Brendan, and it's such an honor to join you at this extraordinary conference in Belfast. My name is Mithu Storoni, and let's dive right in. So, in the world, there are two kinds of people. Belfast has an extraordinarily high concentration of one kind just today. These two kinds of people are innovators and preservers. If you look at the extraordinary kind of size of the world, proportion-wise, only a tiny, tiny bit of the population are innovators. The rest are preservers. Now, we have different names and words for these two kinds of people. We can call them conquerors and just livers. We can call them the sheep who leave the pen and the sheep who stay in the pen. We can also call them leaders and followers, because as innovators, that's essentially what every one of you is. As an entrepreneur, you are a leader because you are extending the edge of what the world has access to in terms of ideas, both tangible and intangible products. Now, through my work, one of the things that's always interested me is what is it that separates the sheep that leaves the pen and runs on the motorway, not feeling scared about the cars at all, instead of staying, eating the lovely grass, staying safe, enjoying the sunshine. Similarly, what is it in the brain that makes a person leave this cozy, warm fireplace and go to a hostile, cold, unfriendly, dangerous environment just to expand the frontier? So I think all of you have a copy of my book, I understand. I hope you enjoy it. That book is filled with a lot of information on this, but for the sake of this talk, I'm going to focus on three things that I find define the difference between an innovator or a creator and simply a product user. Between the sheep that go on the road and the sheep that stay in the pen. And these three things are as follows. Pretty much every exceptional high achiever, exceptional entrepreneur has these three traits. One, they're able to somehow navigate the edge of discomfort, that fine line between feeling comfortable and feeling uncomfortable. They also seem to operate in their own very independent way, which is at odds with the way most of us work and live. And finally, they have an uncanny ability, which all of you in this room will also have, to see what other people don't see. So let's start with the first. So over the course of my work, I've interviewed and spoken to and got to know lots of really exceptional people. And these 3 people are mentioned in my book. You have Jeb Corliss on the left, who is a wingsuit flyer. He's one of the oldest wingsuit flyers, simply because most people only do the job for a few years because it's so dangerous. They don't stay alive for a very long time. Jeb Corliss is someone who does, and I've always been fascinated with what is it that goes on in his mind that made him embrace this very, very peculiar sport, which most of us wouldn't do, even if we are brilliant entrepreneurs. Second person is Johnny Wilkinson. I'm very curious to know exactly what happened in his mind right at that point when he was standing on the edge. What was it that made the difference for him inside his brain that allowed him to perform at that level, where many others would flail? And finally, I mention a third character who is anonymous. I call him PNC. His name is Philippe. And he is really exceptional. He's not in sport, which is why I bring him in, because this isn't relevant only to sport. It's relevant to business, to everything. He's an exceptional achiever. He's a trader at one of the world's best, most successful Wall Street banks. And he has this extraordinary ability to be really, really calm in the face of danger. So with all 3 people, what's so interesting is, when I asked Jeb, what is it that goes through your mind when you are flying at something like 180 an hour, and the difference between you and death, between life and death, is a fraction. Is a fraction of a centimeter even. What is it that goes through your mind? And he told me that he never actually fears danger. Oh, sorry, no, that's not true. He told me that it's not that he does not fear danger. He feels absolutely and utterly petrified of dying every moment of that flight, especially when he reaches those moments. But what he finds exhilarating is drawing back from falling off the cliff right onto the edge of the cliff. So it's exerting control at the moment you feel that your discomfort is so intense that you will fail. It's very similar with Johnny. So if you hear him speak on his podcast, I Am, and the conversation I had with him that's mentioned in the book, he will also describe to you that he felt absolutely petrified when the referee blew the whistle. And he felt just as petrified as someone who isn't even a rugby player. But again, as soon as he drew back from that edge, he felt this sense of extraordinary exhilaration. And the same applies to PNC. So I wanted to know, what is it that's going on at this edge in the mind and in the brain? What do we know in terms of neuroscience? Well, many of you will be familiar with this curve, or this sort of shape. It's known as an upside-down U-curve of performance. It's used so commonly that sometimes it becomes a little bit confused. People use this term for stress and various other things. But the bottom line is, there's a network in your brain that releases norepinephrine. You can think of it, it's called a blue dot network, simply because it looks blue. And norepinephrine, which is known as noradrenaline this side of the Atlantic, is something, again, most of you will have heard. The higher your level, the more alert, the more wired you feel. So we know about, getting the adrenaline pumping, those sorts of terms. Adrenaline is what circulates in the body predominantly, and norepinephrine is in the brain. Now, when you wake up in the morning and you're feeling, you've just woken up, slightly groggy, haven't had your coffee yet, your norepinephrine levels are low. And then, after a couple of cups of coffee, when you feel really sharp and bright and focused, your norepinephrine levels have risen to this middle level. And in my book, and in the metaphor I like to use, I like to think of this as being in different gear states, different power modes. So you're in low power mode when norepinephrine is low. After a few cups of coffee, having a hot shower, going for a run, you get into this middle zone, which is a Goldilocks zone. Here, I call it gear 2. Here, your norepinephrine levels are just right. Why? Because the part of the brain that sits in the front of your head, called the prefrontal cortex, that doesn't like too much norepinephrine. It becomes alive and becomes fully engaged right at this middle zone. Now, you're at the zone, and then, your colleagues have come and given you a few more cups of coffee. So you drink more coffee, and you feel even more wired. And suddenly, you do feel bright and alert, but everything becomes distractible. The reason it's becoming distractible is because now your norepinephrine levels are too high for your prefrontal cortex to stay engaged. So your performance dips again. So very broadly speaking, you have 3 zones. The middle zone is the Goldilocks zone of optimal performance. Now, norepinephrine has got a very interesting quality. Well, it has many interesting qualities, but one of them is especially so. And that is that as norepinephrine levels rise, your brain becomes more plastic. You become better at learning. But if the part of the brain in front of you, the prefrontal cortex, falls asleep or becomes disengaged because there's too much norepinephrine, you cannot learn hard stuff. You cannot think, you cannot decide, you cannot plan. If you are Johnny Wilkinson, if you're really concentrating on those fine movements, you will no longer be able to do so. So when we talk about the edge of comfort and discomfort, what we're describing is the transition from this middle Goldilocks zone, this zone of peak performance, down into gear 3, where the discomfort you feel is really your brain losing control. And we can bring in a third factor into it, which is relevant to everyone, especially innovators and explorers and those sheep, which is the concept of uncertainty. So uncertainty of any kind makes you feel uncomfortable. Or not necessarily uncomfortable, kind of more prepared, more vigilant. And if you're feeling quite sleepy and you have a little bit of uncertainty, you suddenly feel alert. If you're already alert, you have more uncertainty, you descend into sort of a chaotic mindset where you feel fear, you feel uncomfortable. So the boundary between feeling comfortable and uncomfortable, that edge between comfort and discomfort that these high performers like to hover at, is right on the right side of this peak between gear 2 and gear 3. So you can see it's slightly better there. Really, really high performers seem to be able to be extremely good at standing on that tightrope that's right at the edge of comfort, which is your gear 2, the yellow zone, and going into discomfort, the red-orange zone. Now, at first glance, this might seem like, okay, so, what does that mean? Well, for the majority of people who are not entrepreneurs and who are not explorers and they don't want to go to the moon or to Mars, people like to be comfortable in the gear 2 zone. So you like being right around comfort, buried in comfort. But for entrepreneurs, very generally, your mindset seems to shift towards the edge of that red zone. And those who are exceptionally successful as entrepreneurs are able to get right at that margin and stay there. And the question is, of course, how do you do it? So here's a little rule. It's called the 20% rule. And it's a rule that's used by pretty much everyone I've spoken to, and it has a neuroscientific basis to it. And the rule is as follows. If you are learning something completely new, you've never come across it before. Let's do a little experiment. So who in this room is familiar with Mandarin? Hands up? No? Oh, a hand up there? No, hands up. Okay. So if you're not familiar with Mandarin, and I give you a sheet of Chinese characters, most of you will probably look at it and say, I just don't know where to start. I'm not going to bother. This doesn't inspire me, it doesn't motivate me. Now, if I gave you all a sheet of alphabet, letters, A to Z, you would think I'm insulting you because you know it all, and why on earth should you learn? Because there's nothing to learn. But the magic zone of learning happens right in the middle of the two, when you are somewhere between knowing everything and not knowing anything. Now, the 20% rule comes in this form. You have a skill set. When we talk about learning, you cannot learn things out of nowhere. You have to learn by building, by expanding your familiar territory. So when we talk about learning, we're simply adding more branches to a tree. We are extending our skill set. Now, if what you're learning, what you're given, the challenge you're seeing, is so far away from where the end of your known territory exists, you will not be able to reach there and touch that new boundary and draw your skills upwards. So what kind of level can we say with pretty much a lot of confidence is the level at which you should operate, where you can reach to that level, you can touch it, and if you always stay at that level of unknown, you're always going to be in this magic zone of the edge between comfort and discomfort. And that zone is 20%. So practically, what does this mean? So when these high achievers are on that edge and you're just about to fall off, that edge is the boundary of your known. It's the boundary of your skills. You will fall off if your skills cannot stretch to what you're doing. So whenever you're faced with massive challenges, whether they're setbacks, it's a fear of the unknown, what all of these high achievers are able to do is they have an inbuilt mechanism just to always focus on the 20%. Focus on the 20% and pull yourself back. Theoretically, it might not sound very much, but if you try it, you will see just how profound it is. And it is so profound that right now, they are programming AI robots to learn in novel environments using a 20% skill improvement feature. So the bottom line is, if you're standing at a zone which is right at the edge of your known territory, it could be your skills as a business, it could be your general learning overall. You don't want to retreat from that into a zone of comfort, because there you don't learn. If you stay at that edge and you extend your feet by just 20%, and you keep that mindset every single day from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep, and you face every challenge with it, and you also face every boring day with it, then you will always be at the point where your brain is primed for maximal learning. And if you're in a state of learning, then no challenge can overthrow you over that cliff edge. So in any circumstances, always look for what you know and extend it by 20%. Rule number 2, escaping the assembly line. Now, the way we work, the way we exist, the way you're all seated today, actually, is all a hangover from the era of the industrial age, from Fordian assembly lines. We learned at that time that arranging things, ordering them, is really great for productivity. It creates lots of things that you can sell, and that is great, makes great financial sense, and that is a great kind of template to use in day-to-day life. So we started producing things in this way. When we moved to knowledge work, we started arranging our offices in this way. And I'm sure many of you, your offices at home are arranged in this assembly line context. Now, here's the thing. Some of the biggest ideas and the most powerful ideas in the world of science, technology, and innovation in general actually happened before the Industrial Revolution. And many of them happened in the 19th century. And when people had these ideas and made these extraordinary steps, leaps, they were not working, sitting at a desk and looking at a computer. I mean, you will all know that if you're struggling with a problem, you will often find that you're sitting at the desk, you're looking at the problem, you're talking to your colleagues for 8 hours a day, but the solution only hits you when you're out for a walk with your dog at the end of the day. Why? Because when it comes to your brain, input is not directly related to output. And moreover, working and sitting in this way actually shifts your brain's state and shifts you away from a state of innovation. So your brain does not work like an assembly line. There are going to be peaks of extreme innovation, extraordinary output when you suddenly come up with aha moments and solutions. And then you'll have long hills and long valleys where you don't really have any significant output. You don't really produce anything. You can work, but what you do isn't really brilliant. And of course, we can extend this to many time scales. You can be working on something for 20 years and then hit an aha moment 20 years later. But you can shrink this to a moment-by-moment basis. So within a typical day, you're going to have your brain doing really well and then needing a little bit of time off. So it works in oscillations. What happens with an assembly line is, or the standard way of working that we tend to do, sitting in offices, working from the morning to the evening, only leaving our desks when we absolutely must, is we erase the valleys. And the valleys are when the mind incubates ideas. Once you erase the valleys, you also start erasing the peaks. And so what the assembly line model does is it squashes that wave so that you never really have exceptional heights of quality and you never have downtime. So every single person working in this way ends up staying in a zone of what I like to call mediocrity, relative to yourself. Because if you no longer have the highs and the lows, you just stay at a straight line. And if you're trying to cross up to really overcome a problem, overcome a challenge, solve a problem, you never get into the mental state of reaching those peaks where your brain can perform this kind of work. So one of the things that great innovators and really successful entrepreneurs are able to do is they escape the zone of mediocrity and they reach the heights of the zone of innovation, which only happens at the peaks. So how do we do it? So an assembly line way of working, the 9 to 5, or for entrepreneurs, 10 to 10 way of working, usually really takes the form of an assembly line. You're sitting, you're looking at a screen, you're doing 3 things. You're working continuously, so very few breaks. You're working at constant pace, so you don't really vary how fast or how slow or how intensely and how lightly your work is. And third is the content of what you're doing hardly varies. So you sit down with a job and you do the same thing throughout the entire day. So what you have to do is you need to throw that model away and get into working in rhythms. And by that, I mean this. So if you look at the real innovators in the world at this moment, they're always at the top of an entrepreneurial organization's pyramid. They are the Jeff Bezos, the Elon Musks. What do these people do? They don't sit and work at a computer. They do, but in bursts. They don't sit there and sit at their desk from morning to night. Jeff Bezos famously talks about waking up in the morning, pottering about. Elon Musk, we won't go into his intriguing routine. I haven't studied it, but I know that it's definitely not an assembly line style routine. And if you actually go back and remove the shackles of this assembly line attitude of work, of the workplace, and you go back to pre-industrial times, whether you go back to hunter-gatherers or whether you go back to people such as Charles Darwin and Einstein and von Helmholtz, great scientists, great discoverers, great thinkers, they all seemed to work in a very rhythmic way. And there are 3 things that we will talk about today. So assembly line squashes everything down, you want to reintroduce these rhythms back in. And you can do this in 3 ways. 1, throughout an entire day, we don't really think about when we do certain tasks. But in fact, your creativity and your ability to focus varies throughout the day. Second is we should not be working at the same intensity. And third is the concept of 90-minute cycles. So let's start with the first. So if you look at how people perform, independent of when they are required to perform, so how they naturally perform really well, it seems that we actually have a circadian variation regarding when the mind performs certain kinds of work. Namely, creativity, so creative thinking, divergent thought, having innovative ideas, having those aha moments. That sort of mindset seems to be best adopted and achieved first thing in the day and last thing in the day. So if you are, which all of you here are entrepreneurs, and you are working on the innovative arm of your company, and you schedule meetings every morning for the first couple of hours, you are actually killing the best kind of time slot when your brain is in the right state to really ride those waves of peak output, of peak quality of output. Similarly, after lunchtime, there's a dip in attention levels. So if you're scheduling your work so that you will have lots of meetings during the day and you will do focused work or you'll come back to your problem after lunch, you are working against your brain. So instead of just working as a matter of fact, if we actually take the day's work that you need to do and curate it so that it's tailored to these rhythms in the brain, you will find that your output is suddenly massively enhanced. You will be working with your brain rather than against your brain, and your work will be of better quality. Second, work to a power law. Now, when hunter-gatherers, long before our industrial age, went hunting and gathering, and when they still do now in pre-industrial societies, we find a very interesting pattern of movement. And this pattern relates to actually a conservation of energy. It's a hyper-efficient way of working. They hunt and forage short distances most of the time, medium distances slightly less of the time, and they go far distances on very rare or infrequent occasions. And we can see this as a kind of power law. And the reason why it's such a good way to react or to exist or to behave is because it conserves energy. You're not wasting unnecessary energy on traveling those long distances when you can get something nearby. So you should look nearby first. I'm sure this is also a business strategy that's very innate. It's almost intuitive. Now, this pattern is so powerful that it actually exists at different layers of the brain's behavior. So it exists macroscopically. So if you take people and you just let them work, they seem to work in this way naturally. You will do the hardest work for the shortest bouts of time, and then you'll gravitate to lighter and lighter work. It also happens microscopically. So the way your brain stores memories, the way your brain reaches for thoughts is actually also very similar to this pattern. And we can add one more thing to it, which is the concept of working in 90 minutes. Now, I know something called the Pomodoro technique is very popular, very well known on the internet. I propose a 90-minute work cycle. And the reason is that our attention waxes and wanes in 90-minute rhythms. If you're sleep deprived, it waxes, the intervals cut short a little bit, so you would probably shrink this to 60-minute cycles, and in some cases you can go to 100 minutes. But by and large, if you force yourself to keep working beyond 90 minutes without taking a break, you are shifting your brain back into that zone of mediocrity, because you don't have the resources for the brain to rise to its peak. So, how does this apply? So I'm going to just give you one anecdote. There are, of course, hundreds. So this is an excerpt from how Charles Darwin used to work. And he worked in 90-minute sessions. He did his best work, which was creative work, solving problems, first thing in the morning. So he ticks both those boxes. And he also worked according to a power law. And the details of that, the papers of that are in the book. So when you actually look at how people work, you see now you have access to so many anecdotes of personal diaries of great thinkers, high achievers. They all seem to work in this way. There are patterns and there are rhythms at different levels of our existence. And if we flatten them out, we'd no longer reach the peak. And finally, the third point of what truly great innovators seem to be able to do. And it's probably the most baffling one. And it's the idea of how do you see what others can't see? How do you spot gaps in the market? Now, there's already a selection bias in this room, because by virtue of being here, you're all capable of doing this better than the average member of the population. But what is it about your brain that lets you do this, and how can you harness it and do it better? So, one word comes into this, and that word is attention. The world is constantly around you. You know, the world also exists at the back of your head. But at any point, you're only aware of what you're paying attention to. And so it helps to think of attention as a spotlight. And you are seeing what exists right in the middle of that spotlight. And that's what we're all seeing. And so in your day-to-day life, when something grabs you on your phone and something grabs you on the television, everyone's attention is grabbed the same way. So everyone is looking at the same thing. Everyone is looking in the same direction. But what you want to do is you want, as exceptional scaling up entrepreneurs, to extend that edge. How do you do that? You can't extend that edge all the way to the outside, because if something is completely out of your attention field, you will not notice it. And a really great example is you could all at this moment have a pink unicorn sitting right behind your head, and you would not know it. And anyone who looked back, please, that's very funny. So you cannot see what your visual field doesn't cover. But within your visual field, it's actually possible to expand your zone of attention. Now, I'll mention two strategies here. One strategy is one that has been studied in Germany in the context of sport. So when you take a bunch of players, I think they were using handball, but I can't remember. It was a team sport. And they were standing in front, they practiced, so they were team players, and then when they were not playing, they were practicing, sort of simulating their play with a video game. And they looked at the screen, they looked at the arrangement of all the players on the screen. And they had two approaches. One approach was they went in with a strategy, and they saw how well they did. The second approach was, rather than have a strategy, they tried to train themselves to see as much on the screen as possible without moving their gaze. So to notice the periphery. So as you're looking at the stage right now, you could be extending your attentional field, not your gaze, and noticing who's standing on the right and who's standing on the left. It's without turning your head. It's that kind of strategy. And this team in Germany found that when people did do this, interestingly, their ability to become creative when solving problems improved. Another way to do it, this is my final slide, I know we're slightly short for time, uses this. So if there's nothing else, this is probably the most interesting thing I discovered in the course of my book. So remember, your attention and your ability to focus becomes really sharp right in that middle gear 2 Goldilocks zone. That's great. Many people don't have that ability to focus. many people have attention problems. So if you can focus, that's great. That makes you a great entrepreneur. But to be an extraordinary visionary entrepreneur, you have to go one step further. You have to be able to be in that mental state while letting your attention float. Now, this, neurologically, is a very peculiar paradox, because when you are in gear 1, so you know that sort of floaty feeling at the first thing in the morning before you've had your coffee, your attention is not sticky, it's floating around. And that's why in that twilight zone, you are more creative, you are more likely to get those innovative ideas, because your attention, by virtue of your norepinephrine levels being slightly low, floats, because that part of the brain that regulates attention isn't fully engaged. But you want the best of both worlds. You want the part of the brain that regulates attention to be fully engaged, and you want your attention to float. So in the middle of the U-curve, your attention is sticky. You see what everyone else sees. Here is the most simple and easy solution example, one example, mind you, of many, where you can achieve this paradox. So let's talk about walking. Now, unless you're sleepwalking, which is a completely different topic, I'll need another couple of hours for that. If you're walking in the middle of the day, you're taking a walk, a walking meeting, taking a walk during a break, you will be alert because you can't sleep while you walk. You'll be more alert while walking than you would be while sitting on a bench. So walking in and of itself puts you in that middle zone of prefrontal engagement, the magic zone of norepinephrine. But when you're in that zone, your attention should be sticky. So what do? You're using your environment to prevent your attention from sticking. Because while you're walking, you're externally focused. But because the world is moving around you, your attention, your focus cannot hang on to anything for very long. You are forcing your attention to attach and abandon a target, attach and abandon a target. So while you're going on a walk, you're very, very alert in the Goldilocks zone, and yet you're forcing your attention to float. There are other ways of doing this, but this is one spectacular and very simple example which everyone can adopt. And it's no surprise that walking is when many people get their best ideas. And so with my clients, I advise everyone to always prepare for a meeting that requires brainstorming or problem solving with a solo, solitary walk for around 30 minutes. Because that floatiness of attention, what is it doing? When you're being creative, you have fragments of ideas, fragments of thoughts floating in the pool of your subconscious. Your attention, just as like it happens outside, your attention will only come upon them if it accidentally roams over them. If your attention never notices it, those ideas will never come to you. So if you're forcing your attention to just hang in the air, it will encounter those ideas. And we can flip this over. If you're looking at a screen and you're trying to get an aha moment, it will never come to you. Because when you're looking at a screen, your focus lands on what you are anchored to. So I realize we're short for time. I'm going to end it there, but I'd like to quickly ask if anyone has any questions. Very quiet audience. No questions at all? Okay, great. Well, let's have a break. Maybe you prefer the break to questions. Thank you very much.